Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Reading. It's like being completely present and completely absent at the same time.
Hi and welcome to episode 22 of Sundoku, the podcast for anyone who always has a book or 10 by the bed. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. And Michaela, what book have you got there?
Well, I've just finished reading this one. It's called The Last Days of Roger Federer and Other Endings by Geoff Dyer.
I didn't really see you as someone reading a sports book.
No.
Are you a fan of Federer? I think everybody is really, aren't they?
To be honest, I'm not really even a massive fan of tennis, let alone Federer. The book's actually got very little to do with Roger Federer, but it was written during the final days of Federer's career, and Geoff Dyer, who is a massive fan of tennis, arbitrarily set himself the goal of finishing his manuscript before Federer announced his retirement, and I think he just made it in around 2022 sometime.
Okay, well, we'll hear from Geoff Dyer about that book in just a moment. And after that, in our classic spot, we'll take a look back at a writer who was hugely popular in the 70s and 80s, Iris Murdoch. Cath will discuss that highly regarded and incredibly prolific novelist with an expert on her writing, Dr Gillian Dooley. And I have to say, Gillian's in a long line of people who've kept Iris Murdoch's memory alive. She died in 1999, but there have been so many reflections, biographies, and even a film or two, including probably the best known one would be a film called Iris that came out in 2001 and dealt with her dementia in old age and was based on a book by her husband.
I think I recall
John
that
Bailey.
one with Kate Winslet.
Kate Winslet
Yeah.
and Dame Judi Dench, and you can probably guess one was young Iris and one was older Iris, yes.
Okay, well, first to tennis and the last days of Roger Federer. Now, this book really is a very entertaining meander through the topic of endings and last things. Geoff takes a look at famous sports people, artists, the great painter Turner, Mozart, Boris Becker, Bob Dylan. He's a massive fan of Bob Dylan. Also author Jack Kerouac and so many others.
I love it. Sounds so eclectic, but not all of those people ended well.
No, indeed. And Geoff does take a good look at that. I mean, some of these artists and sportsmen had their greatest moments early in life, and they were then left to live out the rest of their lives in relative misery or poverty or all sorts of privations. So it also becomes a bit of a musing on knowing when to quit. Anyway, I'll quit now. I'll let Geoff Dyer explain what the book's about.
It's about the final stages in artists, athletes, composers and writers' lives. And I guess it's about what characterizes that sort of stage, when it begins, and it often turns out that the end begins surprisingly close to the beginning, and also what people do after the end. And it's not a non-fiction book in which you get a really straightforward argument or thesis. It sort of swirls around various issues arising from this consideration of all aspects of the twilight of people's lives.
And we dive right into your book from the very beginning. You know, there isn't a traditional introduction as such. It's written in segments of varying lengths, which I guess I'd describe as, meditations or musings on those last times. And as you say, it loops around. It takes the reader across the lives of many characters. There's D.H. Lawrence, there's Nietzsche, there's Bob Dylan, and that method of looping back and forth, the reader needs to relax and trust you as you take them on this journey, don't they?
Oh, thank you, Michaela. I'm so glad it's this thing of trust is so important, and you're also right to draw attention to the fact there's no introduction to it. And I guess one thing I should say is that I never write proposals for books. The typical way with non-fiction is you do a proposal, send that to the publisher gives you a contract and some money, and then you dutifully fulfill the terms of that contract. But for me, I just write the book about a subject I'm interested in, and then I allow it to find its own form in the process of being written. So I'm absolutely incapable of writing proposals. And then increasingly, I've come to realize I don't like it in books now when I read the introduction, and the introduction is a sort of version of that proposal, whereas the proposal is selling the book to the publisher. The introduction is now selling it to the reader. So I don't like that. And what I hope happens with this book of mine is, because there's no introduction, we plunge straight in. I hope the reader is sufficiently trusting of me to sort of discover for themselves, what is this book about? How is it working? What kind of structure does it have? And gradually, I think, the sort of structure, that looping thing that you've mentioned, will sort of manifest itself, and it will become clear that it's not just some sort of random putting together of various things I'm interested in, but there is both a logic to it, there's a narrative, i.e. the argument develops, but not always sequentially. Sometimes points or situations or discussions are left hanging, and then, they're left hanging. What does that mean? It means there's an element of suspense, I hope, and then it turns out a few sections later, we come back to those suspended things, and it turns out that the argument is deepened, I hope, in that way. And you're right to emphasize that, the book is arranged as 3 loops of 60 sections. And I like the number 60 because it suggests, by association, I think, either the number of seconds in a minute or the number of minutes in an hour. So the loop is crucial to it. And then at the end of the book, I sort of reveal that there are exactly 86,400 words in the book, which it happens. Is it just a coincidence? Well, of course not. That's exactly the number of seconds in a day.
And I'll come back to the concept of eternal recurrence, which you raise in the book on a number of places, because I think that's possibly central to the looping and the circular nature of what you're presenting. But I also know, I was told by someone before I started reading your book that you love jazz. And, that's often described as a conversation between the musicians and the audience. And I think knowing that about you when I started the book, felt that you were having a really lovely conversation with me. That, there's a back and forth in your writing. It's up, it's down, it's light, it's dark, like a conversation is. And I guess I wonder, as someone who's been published many times and who teaches a PhD course to students, is having a conversational style sometimes sort of given faint praise by critics? How do you find yourself justifying this style? I love it, but how do you deal with that?
Well, is it conversational? I mean, it is in a sense that, the best conversation is sort of lively. And also, I think, the particular kind of conversation that I enjoy with my friends is this kind of thing whereby we'll talk about serious things, but at any one moment, that seriousness is undercut by joking. So it's that sort of back and forth that I like so much, so that there's, serious point jokes. That's a way of proceeding. So one doesn't want to be humorless or pompous or pontificating or anything like that. But then I think, the next stage beyond that is whereby you write something where it's both a joke and a serious thing simultaneously. So that's what I'm arriving at. And I guess also it's this thing where it's evolving the whole time. And again, with conversation, it's that sort of thing where you don't exactly know where it's going to go. So, of course, conversation is inherently a form of improvisation. So, I wonder if there's some sort of connection here between the way that I've been writing these books with their sort of invisible structures, let's say. I wonder if there's a connection between that and my love of, the greatest improvising outfit in the world, in my opinion. Those great local boys of yours, the Necks.
Well, I did have a listen to them, and I'm going to have to listen a couple more times before I really appreciate it as much as I appreciate your writing, I have to say.
Right. And I just say about one of the things I love about the Necks, and of course I love everything about them, is that they're on stage performing this really serious music, and then the moment they've finished playing this music, they're just ready for this kind of, very kind of Australian or very English kind of thing of just joking and bantering. That's I like that.
Can I bring you back to that concept of eternal recurrence, which you talk about very much in the book? Could you explain that for us and how that has looped into your writing?
Yeah. So there's lots of people in the book, but the three central figures in it, I would say, are Beethoven, the English painter Turner, and probably the single most important figure is Nietzsche. And of all Nietzsche's ideas, nothing was more important than this notion of the eternal currents, which he summarized like this, that this life as you now lead it, you'll lead over and over again without any variation throughout all eternity. And that's something he comes up with very much in opposition to the Christian idea, whereby, it doesn't really matter how terrible this life is because it only lasts 70 years. And what does 70 years of misery and mortification matter in the face of an eternal afterlife? So what Nietzsche does is really raise the stakes for this life, saying it's this life you're going to lead over and over and over again. And by doing that, what he actually emphasizes is that there is only this one life. So there is that paradox, I think, of both the finite life that you're leading now and the idea it's going to occur over and over again. And for me, when I came across this rather strange idea, it had various effects on me. I mean, it seemed to me it was if you take this as a literal truth, it's a plausible explanation of that sensation we're all familiar with of déjà vu. And then when it came to the book, I thought it was a nice idea to have some kind of something in the structure of the book reflecting this idea of the eternal recurrence, the eternal loop, that is to say.
And it strikes me that it gives you a sense of peace. You don't find that a frightening thought.
Well, it depends. I mean, when Nietzsche first announces the eternal recurrence in his book, The Gay Science, he says, what if somebody told you this would happen? And then we can all think of those desperate times in our life when we're heartbroken, unhappy, or just going through illness or whatever it is, when the idea of living through that over and over again is really, really terrible. But then Nietzsche says, can you think of a moment in your life which is so fantastic that you would say to this person, you are a god, and I've never heard anything more divine. So these moments for Nietzsche are all redeeming. But the crucial thing, he says, is that, it's not like some idealized box of chocolates whereby you can just have the ones you like. Wouldn't that be great if you could just keep eating strawberry creams for all our life? He says, no, you've got to, you say yes to a single joy, and that means you've said a yes to every single woe. And it sort of happened that this was quite sort of pertinent to the aftermath of the book, because just as the book was coming out, I think, Boris Becker was serving time in jail for bankruptcy. So this phase of his life is really, really terrible. It's just awful. And the idea of spending his time banged up in a British jail, of course, doing that over and over and over for all eternity is a terrible prospect. But then equally, you think of that moment so much greater than anything most of us will even get close to, of winning Wimbledon as a teenager. I mean, that's, maybe the whole life is worthwhile because of those moments. But it's an unfortunate thing that those moments that make a life great don't always come at the end. They can come at a very precocious stage in one's teens. Then there's the problem of what are you going to do in the long aftermath? What happens after the end of your career or your moments of triumph like that.
I think you refer to Kerouac in when you say condemned to living his life in the wake of his own legend. It's a very tragic sentence, that one.
Yes, exactly. So it's more typical that, athletes have this long aftermath, but it can happen to writers as well. And Kerouac's is a sort of complicated case because he had this great success with On the Road, but there'd been a long wait for On the Road to get published. And by the time it was published, he was, in a way, he'd become imprisoned by the liberating technique of spontaneous prose that he'd discovered, and then spends, the years of being a sort of rather sort of drunken buffoon-like celebrity, and dies very young. But yeah, there was again a long aftermath for that, and there are numerous variations on this theme. We think of Nietzsche, who enjoyed a quite stunning lack of success during his life, then suffered that catastrophic breakdown in Turin, spent the last 10 years of his life being cared for as a kind of drooling zombie by his mother and sister. So effectively, with Nietzsche, there's this terrifying thing really whereby his posthumous life began while he was still alive.
The book is about lasts, but what I found most entertaining was musing on when to quit, knowing when something should be the last time. And this is where quite often your personal story comes into the book. And I love your stories about, just Burning Man, you're never going to that again, you've had your last time. Same with Bob Dylan, you adore his work, but no more of his concerts. I have to say I took my mum to one of his concerts in Australia back in, must have been 2006, and she felt a bit the same way even back then, and she was a massive fan of Bob Dylan. Do you now subconsciously mark lasts as you think you see them happening in your life?
Oh, yeah. It's I tend to do things one time too many, and I think
Good for
it's
you.
not unusual that you can't really know when something's over until you've done it one time too many. But I think more typically, it's very difficult to recognize when the end has come, both in terms of things that you do for pleasure and in terms of one's career. And this is particularly engaging for artists and writers, I think, because whereas if your job is something that you're doing only to get money, then, of course, you can't wait for each day to end, and you look forward to the working life ending because, then you've got more time to enjoy yourself. But I think with writers and athletes, the thing you're doing for a living is also the thing that invests your life with meaning. So, why would you want to stop doing that?
And in your book, you do talk about people whose work is a drudgery and they look forward to retirement. But writers, on the other hand, don't like to discuss retirement. They don't like to name that last book. And you say how, even reading a book can be considered research for a writer. So you never really need to admit to yourself that you are retiring. The only difference being is if the little rug on your lap is is across your knees in summer and winter, you may have retired.
Yeah. That's right. I think the thing with the writing life is that obviously it's not a job. It's just living your life, really. And as all writers are always telling students or would-be writers, reading is an essential part of being a writer. So yeah, those afternoons when you've just got your feet up and you're on the sofa with a rug over your legs to keep you warm, yeah, that's still part of the writing life. The question then becomes, of course, whether the writing that you're doing, if there's any kind of market for it, or is it just going to be a form of displacement activity whereby you're able to avoid the awful truth that you're losing it.
And it's not just your writing that you love. You love your tennis. That comes through very strongly in the book. And when my mum was 35, she used to talk of it quite dramatically as her last ascending summer. And
Goodness.
I know, I was 13 at the time. I was a bit worried. I thought, it's all downhill here for Mum. That's no good. But it was the 70s, and I guess back then turning 70 was considered quite old. So she was thinking ahead in her typically dramatic style. Do you ever look at your tennis, which you don't want to give up? Do you think to yourself, I'm in my last ascending summer of tennis, or do you think, no, I'm going to keep going on and on and on?
Yeah, well, it's great that you've asked this today. And so today I was playing tennis, and it was absolutely great, and it was a beautiful sunny day here in Los Angeles, and I was playing quite well. And I was really, really sort of happy. And then at a certain moment, I jarred my back, and I kept on playing. And now I'm sitting here, and my back's really sort of locked. And what am I going to do when we finish this chat? Well, I'm on my way to see the chiropractor to try to sort out my back. So it's this seems to me a not untypical day. That's to say, while I'm running around, I feel great and youthful and all this kind of stuff. But then quite often I feel either totally depleted afterwards, or in this case, something has happened to my back, and I've got to get that fixed. But the most striking thing for me is the idea of losing my temper or getting angry on a tennis court is so alien to me, because I'm so blissfully happy to be playing at all at my advanced age.
I won't keep you any longer, because I appreciate you're in pain and you need to get to that chiropractor.
Well, it's not that bad. Let's not exaggerate, Michaela. I'm not in a wheelchair yet.
Not quite time for the cane. How does looking at the last creations of so many artists make you feel about starting your next project? And have you started a next project?
Yeah, when I was writing this book, I was, as I always am when I'm writing a book, I was so happy doing it, and so much less susceptible to the sort of external irritations of the world. And I resolved to make sure that I went on to do what I've never been able to do, which is to say, to act like a career writer and finish this book, maybe have a couple of days off and then go straight on to the next one. And I've never been able to do that, but I was going to this time. Yeah. But in fact, it turns out I wasn't able to. I lapsed into sort of idleness and not doing anything. And I'm used to this pattern now. The problem with it is that it takes quite a long while to build up the stamina whereby you can put in those long, very productive shifts that you can do when you're deeply in a book. So it's a bit like starting over. And I'm currently in the early stages of a book that I've been considering writing for a while about my thoroughly uninteresting childhood in a small town in England in the 1960s. And that's certainly what I intend properly immersing myself in next.
Well, whether it was or was not uninteresting at the time, I am certain you're going to make it interesting for us this time round.
Hooray! Good.
So there you go. As one of Geoff's reviewers said, the less promising his subject, the more brilliant Geoff Dyer gets. And I'm hooked. I've actually got another of his books on hold at the library now. It's called White Sands, Experiences from the Outside World. And it's a travel book, but he also takes us on his personal journey through when he had a minor stroke in his 50s. So that's travelling of a different kind, I suppose.
Sounds like someone who just has to keep writing.
Yeah, absolutely. One of nature's writers.
And now to Iris Murdoch. She was born in Dublin, studied at Oxford, and worked during the war with the UN Refugee Association. Eventually she became a very high-level philosophy academic, but meanwhile she churned out dozens of novels right through the 70s and 80s, and they were perplexing, entertaining, bizarre, complex, intellectual, political, and they always had a finger on the pulse of the times. Many can be read on many levels, and there's a formidable intelligence at play in all of them. Here's Sundoku's Cath and academic Gillian Dooley talking about Murdoch's unique qualities as an author and why she deserves classic status.
Gillian, absolutely wonderful to have you here to talk about Iris Murdoch, who we both had a huge binge on in our youth. How would you sum up her reputation as it's crystallised in the period since then?
Well, she wrote 26 novels. She also wrote at least 4 or 5 works of philosophy. She is now, I think, better known, or at least better studied in academia as a philosopher. But the Iris Murdoch Facebook group has 2,000 people in it, and lots of discussion going on all the time, and people saying, I've just discovered Iris Murdoch, and this is wonderful. And so there does really seem to be quite a community of readers as well as scholars.
And people finding her for the first time.
Yes.
Well, what was it about her that we were so excited about back in the day when the novels were relatively new?
I first read A Fairly Honourable Defeat, which was published in 1974, when I was about 20. And it just seemed, even though it was about people in London, it just seemed to describe my life. So, it just seemed to be about the sort of person I was and the sort of people I hung around with. Gay men, there were people always falling in love with the wrong person, behaving stupidly. Obviously, nobody sort of ended up, in the predicament that they did in the novel, because it's a rather dramatic novel. But nevertheless, it just seemed to have that febrile atmosphere that, to me, was the early 70s.
Was finger on the pulse.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Well, we were talking a little earlier about A Severed Head, and I've got the early Penguin edition of that, which is an amazing set piece for her to have come out with at perhaps the end of the 60s. On the front is the still from a film with Lee Remick and Richard Attenborough and Ian Holm, with a couple embracing on a psychiatrist's couch, with him, the psychiatrist, holding her hand and taking notes and smiling as they get on with it. And you think, well, what was going on there? And that is one of the 4 that I've got, one of which is a kind of a gothic novel about a governess who finds herself in a remote place with a confined woman.
Yeah.
It could have been Charlotte Bronte. Another one is Psychedelia, Bruno's Dream. Another one is The Red and the Green, set in 1916 in the Troubles.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
She could turn her hand to
Absolutely.
just about anything.
Yeah, well, they're all ones from the 60s, and they're not big novels. I mean, you've got those paperbacks there. They're the sort of 1 centimetre thick paperbacks. They got bigger as she developed.
Yeah.
And some of the later ones are quite long and complex. But they've all got the pace. They've all got that. What's going to happen next,
They have.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. And in fact, my memory of all of the novels have been, are probably of those longer ones, at this distance. And my memory is largely about male gurus who possess wisdom of one kind or another taking centre stage, and younger women coming to sit at their feet. However, I think I might have missed a few ironies.
I think you might have. I probably did too when I first read them. Those male gurus almost always turn out to have feet of clay.
So what about The Sea, which possibly is her most famous?
Yeah, well, you don't have to like Charles Araby, the main character, the first-person narrator. She wrote 6 of her 26 novels were written in the first person, and they were all male narrators. They're all very fallible, and so it's very unreliable narration.
Yeah.
So reading those men, every time you read them, you see through them more to what she's implying behind that.
That is one of the dense ones. What happens in a compressed few sentences in The Sea?
The way that she skewers this bloke, he's so pretentious, he's so completely self-absorbed. He somehow thinks it's okay to kidnap someone and keep her locked up in his house because he loves her, apparently.
What's that all about? And the unicorn, where the almost Bronte-esque heroine is being kept against her will but kind of unresisting in this castle, in inverted commas, somewhere in Ireland.
Yeah.
What was she getting at there? Have you thought that that's something to do with how she felt about women's situation in academia?
I don't...
Something else?
Don't know about that. I mean, for a long time there was a feminists' readings were fairly, well, you know, she's not really feminist, is she? She said, you know, I don't believe in women's studies. We should just have studies, you know. So she resisted being labelled. But, I mean, almost every novelist I know of resists labels. They just don't want to be labelled as anything. And Doris Lessing didn't want to be called a feminist, you know. But with Murdoch, you know, because she puts her men centre stage so often, you do really need to start doing some excavating to find the women's point of view. I mean, there are some very, very powerful pictures of women, you know, portraits of women. And interesting, there are very few creative women like herself in the novels. I can think of a couple. In An Unofficial Rose, there's the detective novelist Emma, and there's Honor Klein, in Severed Head, who's an academic, but not very many creative women. But when I was reading for this book that I've just written called Listening to Iris Murdoch, I was thinking of just writing it about the music. But then I started hearing other things in the novels, hearing the way women were squashed, hearing those phrases keep coming back, saying she gave up her career as a musician because when she married, you know, there was a piano, but she never played it anymore because her husband didn't like it. And of course, they never let the women sing. That's one sentence from The Message to the Planet. And you think, what? Hang on, what do you mean? Of course they didn't let the women sing. That's outrageous. So that was the beginning for me of digging and seeing, okay, why didn't they let the women sing? What's going on here? Who didn't let the women sing?
I think the male critics back in the day were rather patronisingly impressed by Iris because she was an intellectual. An intellectual, one of the most intellectual of the post-war batch, I think Raymond Mortimer said.
Okay, right.
And female. But in a way, that's not what strikes you about the novels. The fact that she's a philosophy don is not really what comes through.
No, I mean, it's kind of hard to know because if you know she's a philosopher, you can't help kind of noticing, oh, look, there's someone spouting Wittgenstein or something, you know, in A Fairly Honourable Defeat. I think Wittgenstein gets sort of chucked around a bit. And, you know, a lot of work's been done on kind of excavating the philosophical ideas in the novels and almost reading the philosophy through the novels. So that is quite a common way of approaching Murdoch. I mean, I probably did that back when I was doing my PhD, but I really resist doing that now. I mean, obviously you can't ignore the ideas, but I'm more interested in the how she gets her effects and you know, that sort of thing, rather than what she's trying to prove. Because in her novels, she's not trying to prove anything. She's trying to create a world.
The thing that struck me with rereading these 4 60s novels was that family entanglements seem to be central to absolutely everything, and quite often cousins and stepsons and second wives and you know, mistresses. Sadly that term.
Yes,
but not necessarily siblings, but the extended family complex.
Yes, which is interesting because she was an only child, and she always says she had a very happy childhood. She had no children of her own. She had a lot of Irish cousins, so she'd go back to Ireland and spend time with the Irish cousins. But she was very English.
The red and the green is about a cousin going back to try and impress his Irish cousins.
Yes, and he was Anglo-Irish and a soldier fighting in the First World War, and he goes back to Dublin, and his cousins are Republicans,
secretly getting ready for the 1916 uprising.
That's right. So it's very interesting, and then there's an aunt who's trying to seduce them all, which is typical as well.
She was quite daring in that way, wasn't she? I thought that also struck me. What was the new way in you found to Murdoch with doing this book about the music silences and sound? Yes.
Well, I mean, for example, The Good Apprentice is one of the big 80s novels, very chunky, very complex. Once again, about a young man who there was a mishap and his friend dies and he feels responsible, and he goes off to find his birth father who he hasn't met before, but he's got a stepfather, and there's just incredibly complex family, and he's got a half brother and so he goes off to this other world, this sort of magical world. The father and his new family live in this sort of magical sort of world, which seems like a magical world, but of course, it's a little bit gothic, but it's also very self-conscious. In that novel, the mothers, the women are just sort of very much in the background. The mother of the half-brother, for example, I think probably died young, yes. This very complicated sort of thing. 2 wives died young, and there were 2 brothers, and so the mothers aren't there anymore. But, there's this story about them, one of them being not allowed to continue her music when she married, and then then she had a daughter-in-law and she wasn't allowed to. And these are just fleeting references. They're tiny little sentences. They're little ways in. They're like little peepholes. Then you find, well, okay, then there are more clues. So then you can build up something of a picture of who these women were. I mean, it's an interesting way of presenting, women's stories. It's tempting to say, well, this was her way of saying how marginalised women often were. And, you could read it like that. And the outrageous egotism of these men is a comment. I mean, it definitely has to be a comment.
Why would you say now that we should pick her up if we never have?
Just because you're taken away into another world, and a lot of criticism of her has been that she just writes about people of her own class, public servants, senior public servants, and no one has to work for a living, and it's all very... Well, that's not really true. There's all sorts of people. There are a lot of refugees. There are a lot of, there's a lot of marginalised people in those novels, and but there are a lot of people with great privilege, but they're not necessarily, they're just presented, but they're not particularly criticised for having great... She's not that sort of social realist novelist, as it were. But there's so many things that she does, and then you think, goodness, like in Bruno's Dream, there's this incredible psychedelic episode, and you think, what on earth is going on here? There's these weird characters, and is it because this old man is hallucinating because he's approaching death, or is there really something else going on? And what I think I love about Iris is that you really never quite work it out. They're mysteries. They're always still mysteries, and you keep coming back.
Dr Gillian Dooley speaking to Sundoku's Cath Keneally about Iris Murdoch. Gillian's a senior research fellow in English at Flinders University and author of a recent book called Listening to Iris Murdoch, Music, Sounds and Silences. If that's whetted your appetite for Iris Murdoch, this writer of so many different kinds of books, we'll put all the ones referred to there in our show notes.
You're listening to Sundoku for curious and eclectic readers everywhere.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm in my early 50s and I live in Clovelly in Sydney. I have 4 books currently piled beside my bed, and I've started them all, and I'm at various junctures within them all. I have In the Shadow of the Mountain by Silvia Vasquez Lavado. I have The Subjects by Sarah Hopkins, who's actually from Sydney, just around the corner from me. The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jakul, and Two Afternoons in the Kabul Stadium by Tim Oxhardy. The book that would never be found beside my bed would be a psychology book or possibly a self-help. I like reading positive books, but I don't know if I would actually purchase a self-help book. That's because I'm perfect. I like to read primarily in the evening before I go to bed. I find it's a really nice way to switch off. I'm not good in just sitting in my lounge room or in my kitchen reading. I can't concentrate. I notice too many other things that need to be taken care of. So it's my alone time in bed at night. The only thing I'd like to add about reading books is that I hope people continue to do so, and I think it's really important to actually physically touch that book. I know a lot of people love Kindles, and there's value in that, but I think there's nothing more beautiful than going into a bookstore or a library. There's a particular smell, and it can't be replicated anywhere else, and I think to be able to hold a book and touch the pages is a really important thing. I don't particularly gravitate towards the blue light and computers and stuff, which is why I don't have a Kindle. And, the same is said for magazines and newspapers. I still buy newspapers every Saturday and Sunday because I don't want to read them online, and I have no desire to read a magazine online. I love to buy one fresh from a news agency and flick through the pages and look back at it in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, 3 days' time. So I'll always be someone that needs to physically have those beautiful pieces in front of me and not on a screen.
And remember, if you'd like to share your reading history and reading habits, get in touch. You can record yourself using what you just heard as a guide and send an MP3 to us at sundokukast@gmail.com.
It's time for us to go, but do join us next time. We are going to be talking to some fabulous authors who've come to visit us at Adelaide Writers' Week.
We are going to be busy girls for the next week or so, but there's not many places nicer to be than the Pioneer Women's Gardens in Adelaide.
Couldn't agree more.
I'm Annie Hastwell. Thanks for your company today and happy reading.
I'm Michaela Andreev. Catch you next time. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell,
Cath Keneally,
Sarah Martin,
and me, Michaela Andreev. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokUcast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.